We've been listening closely to the Division community, and because of this, we've decided to work on a free update that focuses on improving the quality of the in-game as well as some core gameplay mechanics so we can make your experience that much more enjoyable. After listening to your feedback, we've worked on hundreds of quality of life changes and fixes, as well as giving particular attention to the top 3 most wanted changes that will fundamentally alter the way you play the Division. Let's take a look at how we address that in Update 1.4.
The Division was Ubisoft's most successful game launch in the entire history of the company. The game sold almost $330 million in the first week globally, a record that still stands for any Ubisoft property. According to Entertainment Weekly, The Division was the highest selling debut entry to a new franchise in the history of the entire gaming industry. At launch, millions of players were jumping into the world of The Division, a franchise that would eventually spawn a sequel game and a spin-off called The Division Heartland. And Ubisoft was basking in the success of its new IP and the implementation of the new Snowdrop engine, developed specifically for use in the Division series. What could possibly go wrong? Ubisoft was at the top of the game with Massive at the forefront. It was just a few short months later when the future of the new Division game that did so well at launch was so very uncertain and unclear whether Massive would support the project any further, and the Division would be dead on arrival. You guys know me, I'm not someone who likes to wield the concurrent player base or player numbers as an indicator of game health, as we know in 2022 that it's not the most accurate way to see whether a game is quote-unquote alive or not. But in 2016, this mentality was not shared by news outlets at the time. The Division had lost almost its entire population of players after release, which seemed odd for a live service game with an end game that was supposed to keep players engaged on a weekly basis. The word around the community and people who comment on the game was 93%. The Division had lost 93% of its player base 3 months after release. People who comment on the game had a field day on the so-called Destiny killer when this story came out. How could that possibly be though? How could that be right? How could the game that sold $330 million and over something like 20-something million copies of the game in the very first week have such a low player percentage at just a few short months after release? Well, I could think of a few reasons. Okay. Bullet sponge enemies, lack of endgame content, graphical downgrades, realistic enemies shouldn't have that much health, unforgiving dark zone PvP experience, loot stinginess. Woo! I suppose I could just say, if you guessed it was because there's an abundant amount of endgame content, realistic enemies that were able to be defeated in a magazine or two, no bullet sponge enemies, graphical fidelity and UI choices consistent to what players were shown in early E3 trailers, then I'm sorry, you'd be very incorrect. And in fact, it was the exact opposite. Many people were disappointed by the graphical downgrades that came with the result of stretched resources and the design of a brand new engine called the Snowdrop engine. This didn't necessarily hurt the game's first week's sales, as people were aware of the downgrades before the game came out. It's also worth mentioning that the game's problems didn't necessarily become apparent to the player base until the very end of the game, when the endgame started. For most MMORPG players, this is where the game really truly starts, and at that time, the endgame was very scant and there was little to no content to do after the 1 through 30 experience was finished. The pinnacle endgame challenge at the end of the Division was Falcon Lost, the hardest mission in the game. In order to raise difficulty and make the endgame feel challenging, the devs resorted to increasing enemy health and damage output. This raised a lot of issues within the community at the time, as the idea of fighting enemies that are essentially human but have the health of a Destiny boss didn't sit right with some people. Psychological issues aside, the Division's endgame was almost non-existent. The endgame loop was all about getting the perfect gear, the perfect weapons with max rolls and the best perks. There were a few problems with this too. Mainly the fact that Division agents did not feel powerful, unlike the way you did in the 1 to 30 experience. The best way to get loot in this game was to kill those named bosses and do the challenging missions to farm for gear. This was made immensely more difficult with the lack of power, and so more problems arose for the game. The stinginess of the game's loot economy was almost as bad as Destiny, where opening a legendary engram could give you a blue gear piece or weapon. Like, what? Even completing the hardest mission in the game at the time, the Falcon Lost Incursion, would only guarantee you a single gear piece for completing the mission. This meant that you would have to complete Falcon Lost 16 times to have a chance at getting all of the pieces for the gear sets that released. And that's not even considering the fact that they might have bad rolls, or duplicates for that matter. So this was pretty ridiculous. The game was hard enough, what with tanky enemies, unrewarding and unfun gameplay loops, and especially in the Dark Zone. The Dark Zone was marketed as the endgame PvPvE experience, but it was hardly that since it was so unrewarding to go rogue in the early iterations of the game. Getting killed as a rogue would lead you to lose many of the Dark Zone levels you farmed for, making it incredibly risky to do PvP in the Dark Zone. And so in patch 1.3, this is where the exodus of players occurred. Many of the players that left cited the issues I mentioned earlier as the reasons for why they left, and probably one of the most important issues, as I've alluded to a bit, was the fact that players no longer felt powerful like they did in the 1 to 30 leveling experience. With the concurrent player base down about 93%, Massive had to step in and do something big and fast. The Underground update was not enough because it built on the same foundation as Falcon Lost and the rest of the game. Massive needed to revamp the game's systems, and it had to happen fast. And that, it did. The Division's 1.5 update was supposed to release in the summer around July, bringing with it another expansion, Survival. And I know we've talked extensively about Survival on this channel, but this video isn't about Survival. Survival and its patch was delayed until the fall, and Massive announced that they are working on a revamp update. This follows the trend of Ubisoft in 2016 actually trying to fix their games instead of just moving on, as Rainbow Six Siege actually received a similar update called Operation Health. The Division's revamp to fix the game didn't exactly have a flashy name like Operation Health, but it was just as influential to the future of the game as modes such as Survival or Last Stand. And in fact, it's well within reason to think that Survival and Last Stand wouldn't have been as well received if patch 1.4 had never happened. So what was patch 1.4? Patch 1.4 was the update that saved the game and arguably spawned the Division 2 and the Division Heartland, since the systems in this patch are still present in both games today. And in this patch, one of the biggest features to come to the game was the World Tier system. The system starts when you reach level 30 and provides a framework to level up and scale the enemies with your own power as you progress through the World Tier system. This part of the update was very well received as players were excited that they didn't have to go through the roundabout way of reaching max gear score. The system begins when you reach level 30 and provides a framework to level up and scale the enemies with your own power as you progress through the World Tier system. This provided structure to the endgame and addressed one of the major concerns of the players, being that the enemies were too difficult and there was little to no structure in the endgame. Perhaps one of the most important changes to the Division during patch 1.4 was the loot scaling. Loot was plentiful, bountiful even. It seems crazy today, but there was a time when red bar enemies didn't always drop high-end and gear set items. The Division 2. I remember jumping onto the Division 1 and I was roaming around, I think the Turtle Bay area, and I killed just a random rider and it dropped an Alpha Bridge chest piece. Like, come on, like that was crazy back then. The loot economy in games such as the Division 2 was just unheard of before patch 1.4, and the Division community responded accordingly. This is probably regarded as one of the best eras for the Division, period. There's not much more else to say. The changes to the loot economy were probably one of the most important and influential changes to come to patch 1.4. There were more changes that came to the game during this update, but they are way too granular to go into during this video. Skills and gear pieces were reworked, and these changes were consistent with the idea of making the player experience more rewarding. And the most important change was the reward system and the return to feeling powerful again in the game, similar to the 1 to 30 experience. And the community sentiment was some of the best it had ever been. Content creators were so excited to talk about all the changes and try out the PTS, kind of like what's happening right now. Players, creators, and developers came together to celebrate this achievement for the game, and the time when patch 1.4 was released was one of the best eras in the Division's history. Gear sets were reworked, talents were balanced, bugs fixed. Everyone was excited to try out the game now that it was actually playable. This is yet another testament to the fact that listening to player feedback will create a video game in which the players actually want to play. And Massive, if you're listening, please make a large Dark Zone in the Division 2 with 24 players. We're begging you, please. But despite the content delays to Survival and Last Stand, the Division was actually able to make the player base come back and try out the game again due to their willingness to rework the game according to feedback and create an experience the players actually want. It was this time period where Massive gained the reputation of a studio that genuinely cared about its players, a quality I still believe they possess. The patch 1.4 update was one of the most significant updates to the game because it represented a time when the Division was at its peak, and I hope the year of the Division can match the amount of nostalgia and hype that fall 2016 held back in the Division 1. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Division Community Series. Thank you to everyone who responded to the poll asking which episode or what I should cover during my next episode of the Division Community Series. This video is possible because of you guys, so I'm gonna probably try and keep doing more polls to see what you guys want covered. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe as it always helps me out, or leave a comment, tell me what you think of the video or what you thought of the Division's patch 1.4. But yeah, that's all I got, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Deltah out. Peace.